Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev announced the Russian government is resigning. The announcement came shortly after Russian President Vladimir Putin made his annual State of the Nation address on Wednesday. This year, Putin has signaled constitutional reform in his address. He proposed giving Parliament the power to choose Russia's Prime Minister and other key positions. This is a major change to the Russian constitution and may offer a hint about his own future, some say. Internationally, he called for national legislation to have precedence over international treaties and rulings when they conflict with Russia's own constitution. Economically, he called for structural changes and aimed to bring Russia's 2021 GDP growth above the global average, and he expected to achieve it through boosting investment. For more on Putin's 2020 annual address in Washington, we have Anton Fedashin, who is a professor of history from American University. In Moscow, we are joined by Dmitry Barbish, political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency. In Beijing, Cui Hongjian, director of Department of European Studies, China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you first, Mr. Barbish, coming from Russia. Help us to understand about the sudden resignation of Mr. Medvedev, the government in Russia, and why the President Putin accepted his resignation immediately.
Well, I think that the initiative of the resignation came from President Putin. I don't believe that Prime Minister Medvedev would himself decide to resign, not only himself, but also the whole government. Speaking about this resignation being unexpected, I would say that the timing is unexpected, but not the resignation itself. Basically, I must tell you that Medvedev's government was not very popular in Russia. A lot of its ministers were seen by the public as pro-Western, too liberal, ready to sacrifice Russia's kind of sovereignty for immediate economic, goals or for other reasons.
But
so
Mr. Barbish,
when Putin won the election in 2018.
If I could, Mr. Barbish, I know you can give an extended answer, but let me ask you about that, because it seems that there's likely to be a National Security Council to be established later, and with which Mr. Medvedev was believed to be able to serve an important position there, together with President Putin. I don't know whether those news can be confirmed or not, but Mr. Barbish, what's likely to be the fate of Mr. Medvedev after this?
Well, the Security Council is already working. It's a kind of, a discussion forum under President Putin. It's not a body that takes decisions itself. It's supposed to help the president take decisions. So this will be a demotion. Whatever position Mr. Medvedev will occupy in the Security Council, and right now they are talking about deputy head of the Security Council, of course this will not be even remotely comparable to his influence as the Prime Minister. But coming back to your earlier question, when Putin was elected by a landslide in 2018, 76% of the voters voted for him. A lot of them voted expecting that he would change the government, because the government was unpopular, especially the education minister, Mr. Livanov, who tried to reform the Russian education system according to Western standards. A lot of people were unhappy about that. So people expected Medvedev's government to go back then, in 2018, when Putin won the election, hinting at major changes in the government.
Okay.
Unfortunately, then these major changes did not take place. All the ministers stayed put. So now, belatedly, we have something that people expected to happen back in 2018.
And what does that mean?
I think if you ask me about the main trend of the changes,
yes, I can tell you, Mr. Barbish,
the main trend of the changes is to...
Mr. Barbish, if I could, what does it mean if the Duma is given more power to select or elect Prime Minister, a change of the Constitution?
Well, this will not happen tomorrow, because in order to introduce this change in the Constitution, a referendum will be needed. So people will have to decide on that, not only the Duma, but the whole population. So it will take a few months at least. Well, most of the foreign observers view it as a way for Vladimir Putin to stay in politics after his presidential term expires in 2024. Basically, if the Prime Minister is not nominated, is not appointed by the President, as it is the case today, if he is elected by the Duma, then Vladimir Putin, being a popular man and having a lot of supporters in the Duma, of course, can hope to become the next Prime Minister after the election in 2024, which will bring a new president in power.
Got it.
But talking about the main trend, just 2 words. The main essence of what Putin said today was strengthening Russia's sovereignty. The idea that judges, ministers, parliamentarians, heads of the regions cannot be people with dual citizenship. This is very important, because Putin wants Russia to be run by people who feel the liaison with the country, who don't have assets abroad. It was prohibited for ministers to have any property abroad 2 years ago, but still everyone knows that there was a lot of mixing between big business and big government in Russia. So Putin wants to remove that.
Okay.
And of course, the change in the government is also moving in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me also invite not only Mr. Babish coming from Russia, but Professor Fedashian joining us from Washington, D.C., who's originally coming from Russia, and Mr. Cui also here in Beijing. Professor Fedashian, your immediate response to the latest decision and news.
Well, it looks like I agree with a lot of what Dmitry said. I would actually put it even sort of more severely in relation to Dmitry Medvedev. His government position, whatever it will be, looks like the Deputy Secretary of the Security Council will now bring him in line with the general public opinion about him in Russia. It's not just that he was unpopular, and Dmitry is absolutely right about that. More importantly, he was irrelevant as a prime minister. Even the ministers within his cabinet received more attention both in the press and sort of inspired more of a reaction from the Russian population than Dmitry Medvedev himself. He was more of a caretaker, sort of a symbolic figure. And so now that he's out of the picture, the question is who will become the next prime minister. And the big question today, both being asked here in the West and in Russia, is whether the new prime minister is going to be the person to potentially succeed Vladimir Putin as president in 2024. And we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Now, Mr. Cui, Mr. Putin, in his 67th year this year, and he's been, in terms of presidency, served 4 terms already. And of course, he's not likely to have a consecutive presidency after he served this term by the year 2024. So from today's State of the Union in the Russian way address given by Mr. Putin and the responses and the immediate reactions coming from the government so far, what does it say about Mr. Putin's popularity and his strength within the country?
Indeed, we can find out some signals from this address from President Putin, and also some change of the government, even the recognition. I think firstly, Mr. Putin tried to maybe make some arrangement earlier before the next terms, maybe a new president. And then secondly, I think he will try to change the discourse, or maybe a kind of a commitment of the Russian politics. We take a notice that this Russian guest mentioned the people, and also the change of the constitution and some other. The third is, I think that Mr. Putin is trying to, find some people or even the government to take the responsibility of the failure of the Russia to reach the economic goal proposed by Mr. Putin.
I see. That's exactly what I want to ask you, Professor Fedashian. Now, how shall we see the division of labor if this constitutional change is done with referendum, as Mr. Barbish earlier proposed? The division of labor between the government, likely the Prime Minister headed the government, the President, and Duma, or the Congress, the Parliament in a way in Russia. How are we going to see the, the proportion of power and the responsibilities being changed, switched?
Once the changes take place, which again will take some time because the referendum will have to happen maybe before the end of this year, maybe next year, but when it does happen, the Prime Minister will be beholden to the elected members of the Duma. In a sense, this makes the government more responsible to the people who vote in their representatives into the parliament. By extension, it also will place responsibility on the parliament for what the government does. On the one hand, it looks like a move towards democracy and responsibility and a more direct link between the people of Russia and the government. On the other hand, it unlinks the position of the president to become sort of like an apolitical figure that sort of hovers above the dirty business of politics. And for those people who believe that Putin is essentially creating a way for himself to stay in power, sort of like Nursultan Nazarbayev did in Kazakhstan, resigning and yet staying in politics, this may be a way for him to remain relevant.
All right, let's have our Russian guest also speak in here. Mr. Barbish, how much do you think you would agree or disagree with Mr. Fedashin? Of course, he's coming now based in Washington. And also, how much does that have to do, what's going on right now, with the economy in Russia, which has not necessarily been picking up if you look at the GDP numbers?
Well, I agree with most of what Anton said. I would only maybe add that there is still a huge difference between Kazakhstan and Russia. Russia certainly has a stronger democratic tradition, so I don't expect cities to be renamed after Putin in his lifetime. And I'm sure that when we are talking about Putin, we are basically talking about a team. We are talking about many people who helped him produce the changes that he brought to the country. I agree with you that there were some economic slowdowns, there were some problems in the last 2 years, but of course if you take into account the economic sanctions, some of them absolutely illegal, which were imposed on Russia by the United States and the European Union, it's amazing that we have preserved the stability of our financial system. And the growth continued. Okay, it's a small growth. It's slightly above 1%. But the international doomsday prophets predicted crisis to Russia, during the last 10 years, as far as I remember. Since 2008, there were predictions of crisis. So basically, I think that what we will see in the next year, indeed, we are going to see the new figure as coming up as the Prime Minister. I would like to tell you that today, because of my job, I speak French, German, Polish, Spanish. So I read all the Western press about Putin's statement. And it was interesting that the Western press, which usually supports stronger powers for parliament, this time was very cautious. Why? Because they supported greater powers for parliament when Putin was starting his presidential term. They hoped that the parliament would oppose Putin, like the Russian parliament opposed Boris Yeltsin during his tenure in office. And now, when obviously Putin is going to leave in 2024, the Western press is afraid that this same parliament would elect Putin as their prime minister.
Is that really the case?
So Putin is a kind of, exactly, he is a kind of a scarecrow for the West. The West has talked itself into believing that all the misunderstandings, all the tension between Russia and the West it's only because of Putin. In reality, it's not the case. You know, Putin
right.
tried to be friendly with the West.
Okay.
It's the West's own actions that led to the crisis.
Professor Fedashian, do you agree? What kind of image is President Putin has in quote-unquote the West, if we could use that general term? And also, how much do you think the change of what we just expected earlier will be able to bring a different way of dealing with the rest of the world, particularly the so-called West?
Well, I don't think there will be much of a change, Jian Wei. I think the West, in the most part, is operating under the delusion that the dysfunction in its relationship with Russia is solely Vladimir Putin's point, and that if you just remove him from power, the Russian people and the other members of the Russian political elite will welcome the expansion of NATO and so on, and regime change experiments. I think it's a very dangerous delusion. It's a very comforting one because it suggests that regime change is the simple key to what is in actuality a very complex set of issues between Russia and the West. So I don't think that that anything there will change. As to Dmitry's point about the West talking itself into believing that Putin is the cause of all problems, I have to agree with that, because the way he is approached here, at least in the United States, has lost all nuance and all complexity. And let me just quote Henry Kissinger, who wrote back in November of 2014, when the Ukrainian crisis was just beginning, that the demonization of Vladimir Putin isn't a policy, it's an alibi for the absence of one. And as one of the most intelligent foreign policy thinkers in the United States, even if people disagree with Kissinger, he's definitely worth listening to.
Well, Mr. Cui, there are a lot of things going on here. First of all, Russia's economy is still struggling, but still efforts are being made. Secondly, there is a belief between the quote the West and Russia in terms of what they agree, what they don't agree with one another, particularly with the controversial figure in the Western eyes of President Putin. And then there's also Russia as a country still having an upper hand in terms of its national defense, as well as the recent geopolitical gains, for example, taking place in the Middle East as a result of the struggling international policy by Washington these days. So, Mr. Cui, how should we now understand Russia in a very different light?
It's difficult to understand, really about Russia, especially I think Russia has a very different, structure of power comparing with some other big players in the world. Indeed, I think now if we take a look at this current situation in international order, we have to recognize now it's a time of the the comeback of big power gaming. So I think it will give some more space even for Russia to play a maybe more important role. Even it has a very, very, small, maybe not so big economy comparing other big economies. But indeed, I think that a very long tradition of military power and also a very good, or even very smart diplomatic skills, it will be very helpful for Russia to take maybe a stronger position in the international affairs.
A lot of people have been talking about strong political figures these days, vis-à-vis the rise of nationalism and, even unilateralism in some countries. How should we understand all of this mixture of new phenomena, Professor Fedashian, briefly from you?
Well, listen, the single most important factor in encouraging regionalism and nationalism has been the abuse by the United States, unfortunately, especially under the Trump administration, of sanctions. The inevitable outcome of these kinds of policies is to force countries to start becoming increasingly autarkic and searching for immediate allies within their region in order to avoid pressure coming from the global hegemon, which certainly structurally is what the United States remains.
All right. We are running out of time. I want to thank the three of you. There are a lot of big ideological words being used in this discussion. I don't know whether our audience will be able to digest all of them, but for now I want to thank the three of you for sharing your insights. Anton Fedashian, Dmitry Barbish, and Cui Hongjian. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Turning to a new development, let's go to a story from Shanghai. The Shanghai municipal government says it is suspending official contacts with Prague. The announcement comes after the Czech capital signed a sister city agreement with Taipei. The Shanghai municipal government expressed its stern opposition to the move, adding that Prague has wantonly interfered in China's internal policy and publicly challenged the country's One China principle. And for more on that, I want to come back to Mr. Cui Hongjian for some brief comments. Your take about the Shanghai municipal government's reaction?
I think it's a very natural, result because of the municipal of Prague, did something wrong, especially trying to challenge, I think, the core interests of China. And also, I think.
What is the core interest of China?
For example, the territory and also integration of territory and sovereignty. As we know, especially now, the Taiwan issue becomes more important and sensitive now in the Chinese, and also the Chinese position in the world. And of course, I think it's a little bit, ridiculous for me to understand what happened for the Prague municipal. I think mostly it's a kind of a personal behavior by this Mr. Mayor from Prague, because as he announced the reason why he tried to get some more, closer relations with Taipei, because Prague tried to get some more economic cooperation and also more cultural exchange. I think it's ridiculous, because if we take the understanding of what's the size of the economy in Shanghai and what's the size of the Taipei economy. Shanghai last year maybe more than $700 billion US, for GDP, almost the same size like the Taiwan region as a whole, and also cultural exchange. What happened between, take some comparison between Beijing and Taipei. Beijing has a long history, and so I think it's a very, very, it's not so, it's out of common sense indeed.
I see. Another thing is the local election in Taiwan, where the DPP have quite a win there. What does that mean for the future of cross-strait relations, particularly for the other governments and capitals to understand the significance of the one country principle, one China principle, that China as a whole has been holding quite dearly, so that they would not make unintentional mistakes?
Indeed, if we can try to find some logic behind all of these political changes, not only in Taiwan, some other cities, including Europe. If we know the new municipal administration of Prague, we can find out maybe some similarities between the political change in Taiwan and also in Prague or some other cities in Europe or some other countries. So now I think perhaps there will be some more momentum for some politicians, especially with some populism, nature. They try to challenge something, because as we understand always, the golden principle for some populist figure is we need to show we are strong enough. How could you show you are strong? You try to challenge some, big country like China, and to show, okay, I did a good job like that. So I think yes, it will become more important for China to understand what's the real situation and the political change in some cities and the capitals. And also, of course, at the same time, I would like to say that the Taiwan issue finally it could be decided by the central government level. So this change of the Prague municipal administration will not change, the attitude or stance of the central government.
Thank you very much, Cui Hongjian, for your analysis. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into our search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.